proposals. I looked at it down. I'd like to know your stand on immigration.
Yes, ma'am. She's asking if you couldn't hear about immigration. There are several things. First of all, you know, I mentioned earlier that NAFTA, these CAFTA, these trade deals were, remember what we were promised when those deals came along? We were promised they were going to create jobs in America, and they were going to improve economic conditions in places like Mexico, so there'd be no reason for them to immigrate to America. Right. Cost us millions of jobs, done nothing to improve economic conditions in Mexico. So the starting place is America needs to have both a trade policy and a foreign policy that improves economic conditions in other places in the world, all for the purpose of creating conditions where people live that they can sustain themselves, that they don't have a reason, an overwhelming reason to try to come into the United States. That sort of gets to the underlying issue. Beyond that, we need to secure our border. Our border is a mess. It can't be sustained the way it is now. Elizabeth tells us a great story about, she describes what happens, I'll let her tell it, but she describes what happens when you go into a Blockbuster. You all been in a Blockbuster before? You know, you go into a Blockbuster and you don't see anybody, you always hear that voice that says, "Welcome to Blockbuster." So Elizabeth says if we can figure out when somebody's coming into Blockbuster, we ought to be able to figure out when somebody's coming into the United States as well. And then she added, the other day she heard me tell a story, and she added to that, and if we can't figure it out, why don't we ask Blockbuster? In all seriousness, there's technology available that we're not taking advantage of that provides much more security on our southern border. I'd have more border patrol. I do not favor building a fence all the way across the southern border. I think that's money. I think there might be some isolated places where fencing would do some good. I think we ought to be much harder on employers that are violating the law. And then the most difficult question, and the one that creates all the divisiveness, is what do you do about the people who came here and are undocumented? Now, I'm not for amnesty, but I am for a path to earn citizenship. And that means, from my perspective, that there are a couple of things they ought to have to do if they want to become American citizens. One, pay a fine if they came here illegally. And the other, which is a little more controversial, is second, if they want to become an American citizen, they should learn to speak English. Those are the things that I would do. But they're telling me to stop. And I want to make sure that I call at least one young person. It's right here. You're it. You just yell it, and I'll say it back.
Could you speak a little bit about environmentally sustainable economic development and alternative energy?
I will. He's asking about environmentally sustainable economic development and alternative energy. My view is that Al Gore's got it completely right, that we have a crisis in the world with global warming, and America has got to be leading very aggressively on this issue. What I would do is, first of all, let's talk about the problem. We're the worst polluter on the planet. We put out 25% of the world's greenhouse gases. We're only 4% of the world's population. We use 22 million barrels of oil a day. So what do we do to change that? We have no credibility with the rest of the world in trying to fashion a global solution. We should have a cap on carbon emissions in America. The cap ought to come down every year. We ought to reduce our carbon emissions by at least 80% by the year 2050. We may need to do more, but that's today what the scientific consensus is on the aggressive end. And then below the cap, we ought to make polluters pay. And they'll have to pay to get a permit. And if they get a permit, and they pay for it, that money, which should be at least $30 billion, should be invested in clean, renewable sources of energy. Wind, solar, cellulose-based biofuels. Now let me say, since we're getting close, there are some actual differences between the Democrats on this. Unlike Senator Clinton and Senator Obama, I do not, I mean, you could be on either side of this, but you deserve to know the differences. I do not favor building more nuclear power plants. I'm against building more nuclear power plants. I do not think it's a safe way to dispose of the waste. I think they're dangerous and they're extremely expensive. And they take forever to get online. I think we ought to have a moratorium on the building of many more coal-fired power plants until we have the ability to capture and sequester the carbon. And then finally, I think we need a president of the United States who asks Americans to be patriotic about something other than war. Who says to America, we have to sacrifice together. I think of that famous John Kennedy inauguration speech, ask not what your country can do for you, Well, we're in that place. And we need a president who asks America to be willing to sacrifice, to change our behavior, to take responsibility. That means conserving in our homes, in our workplaces. It means driving different kinds of vehicles. And when we do these things, we start on the right path, then we can go to China, India, the rest of the world, and fashion a global solution to what is clearly a global problem. Now, I have to stop now because, as I mentioned earlier, 36 hours is a long time. I got a bunch of other events to do, but I want to say to everyone here, I value your caucus participation and I value your questions. If you have a question that did not get answered today, I have the responsibility of answering that question. So I've set up a website for you, for caucus goers. It's called, it's easy to remember, johnedwards.com/askjohn. If you go to it and submit your question, it will be answered before the caucus. That's my responsibility, and I'll meet that responsibility. I want to say one last thing to you. I learned a hard lesson a few years ago when somebody came up to me after an election and said, as a woman, and she said, "Edwards, you know, I kind of liked you, I might have voted for you, but you never asked." I will not make that mistake again. I am asking every one of you to go to the caucus for me on Thursday night, to take your friends with you to the caucus, make it a wonderful evening. It looks like right now the weather's going to be pretty good. We hope so. But I'm asking you to do that. I really believe that we can change this country. And I believe that we can do it together. And I think that seed of change is going to begin right here in Iowa on Thursday night. And I'll make you one last pledge, every one of you. If you're willing to stand up for me, and if you're willing to caucus for me, what I'll do for you is I will fight for you with every fiber of my being, and I'm going to give you back the real Democratic Party, the White House, and we're going to give you and your children back in America. Thank you all very much. Wonderful being with you.